library. Hanging above the fireplace in our church library is a lithographic print of a painting of Francis David at the Diet of Torda, an iconic image among Unitarians of Hungary and Transylvania, more common perhaps than the Last Supper, which depicts the reformer addressing the National Assembly in 1568 when he encouraged the king and the assembly to adopt what came to be known as the Edict of Torda, a landmark declaration of religious toleration. At the time, the Unitarians were in the ascendancy, and they could have easily decreed that Unitarianism would be the religion of the realm, but instead they sought to grant religious freedom to all. Commissioned by the Town Council of Torda, the original painting created in 1896 by Aladar Koresfoy Kreisch, using composer Franz Liszt as the model for Francis David, now hangs in the town's Museum of History. Our print was presented to All Souls Church when its building was dedicated in 1913, a gift from the Hungarian Unitarians to this then struggling congregation, according to tradition. It originally hung on the wall of the minister's study on Furby Street before making its way to our old building on Banning Street, where it hung on the back wall of the sanctuary for as long as I can remember. It is a dramatic reminder of our historic roots in Reformation-age Transylvania, a memorial to one of the most forward-looking religious thinkers of all time, a testament to the golden age of our liberal religious tradition, and a symbol of the shared faith that binds us across continents and oceans. I have always been captivated by the scene and moved by the story behind it. Francis David was the subject of the first sermon I ever preached back in 1982. And in gratitude, Philip Peterson paid to have the framed picture restored, although it looks like it may need a little more work again. It was a favorite of his, both the picture and the story. And it was the deep impression it made that led Don McKinnon and me to visit Hungary and Romania more than 20 years ago to tour the Unitarian villages there, in search of the places where Francis David walked and where people have kept faith with his vision and teachings for more than 4.5 centuries. We think of our tradition as relatively recent, but it is deeply rooted. On a Friday afternoon during our tour, while visiting the village of János-Falva in the Homorod Valley, or as they say it, Homorod János-Falva, I was invited to preach the following Sunday, which was one of the most important Sundays of the church year, Pentecost, one of only 4 or 5 occasions each year when our Hungarian friends celebrate communion. Believed to date back sometime between the 1st and 3rd centuries, the village, the church there was erected in the 13th century. And like many churches in Transylvania, it is surrounded by a low defensive wall that was intended to protect it from the conflicts and conquests that characterize the history of the region. It was never occupied by Turks, which seems to suggest that the defensive wall worked. Formerly a Catholic church, it embraced Unitarianism in 1571, just 3 years after the Diet of Torda. At its peak, a little more than a century ago, Jonasson was home to 367 souls. But when Dawn and I visited, there were about 175 people living there, all but one of whom was a Unitarian. Imagine being surrounded in your home neighborhood by other Unitarians. It works in Jonasson, but I don't know that you'd want to experience it necessarily in Wolseley or River Heights. Now, it can sometimes take me a whole day or longer to come up with what I think is a clever sermon title, even before I begin writing the content. So I was under a lot of pressure, and I felt it. But really, I didn't need to worry about it in this case. The reading for that day had already been assigned, and I was expected to preach about what that text meant. Easy peasy, as they say. Titles were superfluous, almost unnecessary. Given the day on the liturgical calendar, the reading was from the book of Acts, and it recounted the story of Pentecost, which is considered to mark the birth of the church. It was a revisioning of the Jewish Feast of Weeks, Shavuot, by the early Christians who were, after all, mostly observant Jews. What could I possibly have to say about this? I was a religious humanist who dipped into the Christian scriptures more for seasoning than for substance. But I would be speaking to those for whom the question, are Unitarians Christian, would be an absurd thing to ask. I was in the heart of Unitarian Christianity. I needed to overcome every prejudice and preconception I held about the story of Pentecost, and most especially the modern Pentecostal movement, to try to understand the biblical story and appreciate its continuing relevance to Transylvanian Unitarians in the early years of this century. I reflected on the text while Dawn enjoyed socializing with the villagers. I needed to have a sermon written by early on Saturday afternoon, also early for me, so that the minister could translate it into Hungarian by the next morning, when we would stand together in the high pulpit, me saying a paragraph in English while he repeated it in Hungarian, with the exception of one paragraph, which he had transliterated for me to give strictly in Hungarian, which I did, and thought I had done rather well until he started to say the same paragraph in Hungarian, stopped, the congregation laughed, and then he said what I had said in English. In my mind's eye, my thoughts turned to the painting that had led Dawn and me to Jonasson in the first place. I could see Francis David looking heavenward, the Holy Spirit itself seeming to shine down upon him, illuminating the sanctuary of the ancient cathedral at Torda, much as it was supposed to have come down to the early Christians at the first Pentecost in the time of the apostles. Just as they were filled with the Spirit in those days, so were our forebears in Torda. And so are we today, even though we may understand the experience differently. The Spirit dwelt among us that day as surely as the sun rises and sets, the seasons come and go, and human hearts beat out the pulsations of eternity. In the Acts of the Apostles, it is written that the people were all together on that first Pentecost, and that suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind. Think yesterday. The spirit that animates our lives is not always gentle and mild, but sometimes comes rushing upon us with a power so fierce that we can barely remain standing in the midst of it. The book of Acts then tells us that people began speaking in tongues, in many different languages, yet they were able to understand one another. That seemed to be a fitting story for that Sunday, since I was able to speak to the congregation since I was unable to speak to their congregation in their own native Hungarian, but prattled on in English while their good minister translated my message for them. How I wished that Pentecost would come again, as it is reported in Acts, right there, right then, so that we might have spoken to one another in different languages and yet fully understood what each other was saying. While we can scarcely believe that people can really speak in tongues and be understood, we can yet hope that the differing languages that too often divide us can become bridges rather than barriers to human understanding. What actually took place on that early Pentecost Sunday, we don't really know. But we do know that something decisive transpired, observed Harry Haler, a Unitarian Christian minister from a generation ago. Something took hold of that small group of Jesus' disciples, stopped them in their tracks, and turned them around. Something occurred in their lives which changed cowards into heroes, doubters into believers, the despairing into the hopeful. Something filled them with radiant and courageous faith, giving them an inner strength and drive that they did not have before. Something happened to enkindle and wholly inflame their hearts, something totally unexpected and unplanned. And while it might be easy to doubt their experience, even scoff at it perhaps, many of us, most of us, have known such moments of inspiration in our lives when everything seemed clear to us and we felt as though we knew the way forward, even if we didn't have words to express it. It is this spirit, I believe, that animated the Hungarian Unitarians at Torda to have proclaimed an edict of religious toleration, because they understood that we could express what was deepest in our hearts through different languages of faith. I think it was present that morning in János-Falva when Dawn and I were there as guests and somehow felt a connection that transcended our different languages. I think it was there with my ama and my bachan in quiet moments when we understood one another despite not speaking in the same tongue at the same time. And I believe it was there last Sunday at Pride, when people from varied religious communities and from none, when people from every political party, when people from every conceivable profession, when individuals from every neighborhood across this city and beyond gathered together because we were moved by the Spirit to recognize that we were more one than separate and to do something about it. If we cannot believe the story in the same way our neighbors of other faiths do, what then can we make of it? Just what is the Holy Spirit to Unitarians? How does it affect us? What difference does it make in our lives? In the Hungarian Unitarian Catechism, their young people preparing for confirmation learn that by Holy Spirit, we mean the power of the divine. and its help for good, which clarifies the intellect, cleanses the heart, and strengthens the will, thus enlightening, calming, and encouraging and making one happy. Can we not say almost the same thing here today on this occasion? After arriving in Jánosfalva, I had caught a glimmer of the Spirit in the eyes and voices of the children there on the Friday afternoon when I was desperately trying to imagine what I would say on Sunday, wondering if I could even find something to say. I had the pleasure of joining the minister and several of the children as they gathered for their regular religious instruction. We met in the kindergarten room where those sweet young souls sang 2 hymns in English for my benefit, including the familiar song, Spirit of Life. I have no idea how fully the children understood the meaning of this short hymn, which they sung in a strange language to them, but I do know that they sang with joy and with earnest feeling. When we were done, I returned to my room in the old cantor's house and wept. I honestly wept with joy. I had been so deeply moved by the gift these children had given me. The room was filled with love and kindness, thoughtfulness and respect, even reverence. The Spirit that allows us to speak in different tongues and yet understand one another is nothing less than love. Love itself. If the people who gathered for the first Pentecost were truly able to understand one another while speaking in different tongues, only love can account for it. The Spirit that clarifies the intellect, cleanses the heart, and strengthens the will so that we are enlightened and calmed, encouraged and happy is nothing other than love, which we humans make real in the world by loving our neighbors as ourselves. It is the love that heals all wounds and redeems all who are separated. It is the love that Francis David spoke of when he reputedly said, "We need not think alike to love alike," which is actually a passage from John Wesley that North American Unitarians have appropriated for themselves and put into Francis David's mouth. It is the love that is proclaimed in the banner that hangs on the front wall of my old church in Arburg, which says God is love. And it is the love we affirm in worship here each Sunday when we say together that love is the spirit of this church and service is its law. The Hungarian Unitarian Catechism maintains that the Spirit of God is working in us today as well, enlightening our reason, enabling us to know goodness and truth, and strengthening our will to persistently remain close to them. At the same time, it makes our frailties known, causing us to reform and to improve ourselves. It is in this light that our spiritual kin in Hungary and Transylvania understand the meaning of Pentecost. Their language may be more traditional than ours, their stories may be more ancient, but their kindred spirit is unmistakable. When we take time to consider what is good and true, and then live our lives in ways that elevate goodness and truth over evil and falsehood, when we cultivate our minds in ways that enlighten our reason rather than our passions and our prejudices, when we strive to live with character and integrity, learning from our shortcomings and seeking to do better tomorrow than we were able to do today, then each one of us manifests these aspirations in the world. We need not be great to be good. We need not be brilliant to be truthful. We need not be conventional to live with conviction. And we need not insist there is only one way one language to express the essence of who we are and what we stand for. On that Sunday, Don McKinnon and I both experienced firsthand the common spirit that bound us together, that continues to bind us together with those who stand in the same stream of liberal religious thought, even though they may express it using words that we find antiquated. We discovered that it's possible for each of us to express what lies deep within us using very different words and yet still understand one another. In a word, Don and I both discovered Pentecost in a small Transylvanian village in a 13th century church, for a single spirit held us together, and we knew we were one. Please join in the closing hymn, number 318, We Would Be One.